Hello again, it's Dia Brie coming to you live from the center of the United Kingdom. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how the media speaks about race. I will start with my solution and then I will track backwards to why I see this will resolve some of the issues that we see but don't see in the media today. So I think that all media outlets should openly acknowledge the race of the people that they speak about. For example, if there were a news reporter reporting on a story, for example, the Indian elections. So you have, your BBC correspondent or your CNN correspondent. Oftentimes it's on radio where they even more speak about it because they have to tell more of the narrative, and it's where you'd see what I'm about to tell you more. But they'd say, okay, so our white correspondent in South Asia, or our white correspondent in Kenya, or our white correspondent in South Africa, just as, you would say the black victims of the South African mining event, or, that sort of thing, and often how we acknowledge race here, particularly in crime. And that gets to why I think we should do this. Because there are now only certain instances where these journalists acknowledge race. So, of course, we're used to hearing people talk about the fact that this implicit bias becomes visible, becomes explicit in the media in one way when they talk about the others. Who are the others? The non-white peoples. So, you'll have the Chinese people. And you'll often even have, especially here in the UK, you'll have journalists who speaking of a story, it could be any story, political, social, art or whatever, but the Chinese, how do the Chinese respond to this art piece? Or how do the Chinese live under that regime? Or how do the Chinese respond to these market forces? And it's quite nuanced because here, of course, British media would be speaking domestically, so they would tend to nuance discussions about themselves more. So, of course, the regions, Scottish or Irish, religious, identifying people in the conflict in Ireland. But then, of course, when things become more urban, that's when you really hear that, urban crime and all the things around the best demonstrations, of course, all around the riots that happened in 2011 following the riots of 2011. Let's leave it that way. And the very way that race had to come to the fore, even though many people who spoke about it, both journalists and often the public in their comments, but also in their comments that the journalists then pick up on and turn around. In those areas, you see that people are often in two poles. They either resist talking about race at all, or they make race front and central. I think where they meet is how class is really what we're talking about here in the production of an underclass. And so we're used to talking about the underclass and those who are outcasted by our society in terms of how they're racially identified, or even, how would you say, geo-globally identified racially, how the media looks at the other here from our perspective. And it's important that we talk about whiteness as well, because I think it's essential both in terms of how we postulate diversity, and I'll show you why that impacts diversity in two ways. First, it would, again, force us to acknowledge that when we send, for example, foreign correspondents to foreign places, their race does impact the field. Their race does impact their access to, the place where the journalists are staying, in the middle of a war zone. Or, not just that you would have on a bulletproof jacket in an actual war situation, but that your whiteness would allow you easier access to a UN area such as a refugee camp, or even into high level press conferences where your credentials are first and foremost announced by your own otherness, your whiteness, and in those instances superiority, to where doors are easily opened. You don't have that hurdle of having to prove yourself or getting over that bit of doubt about who you are and why you are. If you're, for example, a person who looks like me and you're a correspondent or a researcher, or an administrator, for one of these international organizations, and going into a population that is of color. Um, I've spoken at length about this, about me being a black person in South Asia, in other videos. But, for the purpose of this video, even consider a black person being a correspondent, since we're talking about media, in Africa. I, as a Western black person, have lived in Africa and seen the very interesting ways that our identities are dubious, simply because we are, this black person in a black land. And so, again, I emphasize that whiteness does grant you access to aspects of life that do impact your job, the story that you're able to tell, the story that you are telling. And I think the public needs that awareness. And not just when the narrative is to reconfirm, as many cultural critics have said, Cornel West, Michael Dyson, Bell Hooks, but even lay people readily knows. We talk about it in my home, growing up, that the narrative of the underclass, that is in need of a savior, that is causing crime, that politicians ride their backs on being tough on crime, on dealing with poverty in one way or another, making it vanish or invisible to us. And so there's always that implicit us told in these stories, no matter who we are consuming them. So we begin to internalize who we see ourselves as a society as, and then Hollywood just reconfirms that through its hero narratives, of who our central, our core identity is, and therefore the others are literally just others on this, as you could say, a totem pole. And I think that if we were to be more explicit about race, we will be forced to question, why is race so central? Why is actually, wow, race really matters in our lives? So I think speaking about it more would, of course, raise our awareness as the public, but also as people who produce media. We will begin to question why it is that we are able to tell the stories that we tell, to forward the positions, the perspectives that we do, and do so unquestioned. I don't want to go through the hierarchy in media organizations of how, and even just down to HR and hiring, practices, which also is another side of the kind of implicit racial biases that we really need to talk about. And I think addressing it in the media will open another avenue for public conversations that would also impact HR. But just looking at who the media are, if we know an HR is one of the sites of implicit bias, such that in France, if you have a Muslim name, people look at your CV and throw it away, right in the garbage can. Here in the UK, we know about those implicit biases. And of course, in the US, just to bring it all home, we know that people hire like people. If I can see myself in you, I'm more likely to hire you, even when a comfortable person presents themselves. Now, I'm been in education for many years, both being a student and also being an educator. And I can tell you that teachers have preferences. So the forming of the society and its self-justification for what is a way to be, who is, a valid person, and everything else is sort of, less and less and less central from the forms of power that then that central identity is able to access in order to be, for example, a hero and goddamn near every Hollywood movie, or be the central person leading politics in damn near every country, or be the central person who's at the head of every top corporation around the world. We see the racial, gender, class, implicit hierarchy structure everywhere. There is this caste system. And it is important that we think about our dominant ideologies because, well, I think spirituality is the primary site that people have organized to contrast where our other social structures often take us, back to our most, dare I say, animalistic behaviors, because they're all those systems. The economic system, the political system is built on competition and not cooperation. It's built on compete. We, in such in America, it forms a part of every aspect of our lives. Children compete in school. People compete for business. People compete for. I mean, it's just that we think that competition builds excellence, such that the idea of cooperation almost seems foreign. Now we know that we need to cooperate in certain ways in order to build bigger infrastructures, to build ever more competitive infrastructures, houses, things that can go on the market that all have to do with our lives, and yet the way that we mediate them is through competition. And again, this ties us back to where I originally started, that I think that the language that we use racially also enforces the idea that there is a competition. It's implicit that males will be winners, that the color caste in your relative society, those people at the highest of that color caste will win. People who come from privileged class backgrounds, they will be advantaged. So this means that the people that we get to see and know as powerful in our society, both those who lead us in our respective communities, organizations, and those who tell us the stories about those, are also reflective of that hierarchy. So yeah, you go to Brazil, multicultural society, cream of the crop, looks pretty creamy. You go to India, richly colored, nation, subcontinent, from mahogany black to milky white, gory gory, and look at who rises. Look at who rises. Interestingly, that often in these caste systems, like the one in South Africa, like the one in the United States, like the one in India, the biracial body often signifies something quite interesting, and we'll get to that later. But looking at that in both Indian and American politics, just think about that in terms of the color caste. But the speaking about race, it is so, and the ways that I've discussed here, is so implicit. It's such a part of the air of our lives that until we find ever more ways to articulate what this is, because remember, it doesn't mean anything unless we are able to really speak about it. We can't really comprehend it unless we have a language to exchange about it, to build ideas into concepts, and therefore be able to say that I want to, be this way when it comes to social hierarchy, as opposed to just going with the flow of things. It is critical that we develop that language, and the media is very instructive. And by media in this instance, I also do mean pop culture. It is very instructive in how we view the body and how we come to see the body and what becomes a beautiful body, a powerful body. We must find ever more ways to have these kinds of conversations. So, send in your thoughts. Have a good one.